Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have the Reread Book Tag. I was tagged by Dane of Dane Reads and I think that this tag was created by either Scallydandling About the Books or Mark Nash, or both of them. I am not properly aware of these things, nor have I watched any of the videos related to this apart from Dane's this morning. I was originally going to record a video about rereading a certain book. However, Dane tagged me in this, and there is a question coming up that is somewhat perfect for that. So I suppose we better begin. Let's assume you do reread if you're doing this tag. So where do you sit on the rereading scale from almost never to all the time? Rereading is something that I do. I fall somewhere in the middle of that scale, in that I have no problem with rereading. All of the books that I have on my shelves I save because I want to reread them one day. I've liked them that much. And indeed, I read a book last month and then reread it again at the start of this month because I liked it so much. I have this dream that one day I will be able to do what I used to do as a child and find the book that I just want to reread all the time and do that. Again, a question that's coming up later on. 2. Has that changed over your reading life? I have talked much and more on this channel about the fact that as a child, and indeed now, we didn't have a lot of money. And so books were always gifts to me. Indeed, I didn't own a book until my 7th birthday, and that was Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Any book that I owned, since I have always liked reading, has been something that I would reread all the time. And as soon as I'd finished one book, I would go to whichever was the next one on my shelf. I originally only had I had a 3-shelf bookcase that my parents let me have that we used to keep videos on, and it took me years to fill those first 2 shelves, and then by the time I was 11, after enough birthdays and Christmases, I ended up with 3 stacks, so 6 shelves full of books, although admittedly about 3 of those shelves were filled with my grandparents' books that I used to just go to their house and take them, or relatives would die and they found out Charlie was the reader, so they just throw books at me, which is where these Dickens books came from. These Dickens books here were all damaged in a flood, and so I have never been able to read them, but I like them. They have a connection to my great-grandparents, and despite not being the most nostalgic person, I now use them as bookends. 3. When do you reread? Maybe immediately after finishing a book, or not till years later, or when the mood strikes. Definitely when the mood strikes. The book that I want to talk about later on was one that I was feeling particularly nostalgic after I mentioned it, and so I chose to reread it. Sometimes I get in a certain mood and I know that there is only one book that'll fix that, so I'll reread that book. Sometimes I just feel like there's a book weighing on my mind. I've heard a lot of people on YouTube talking about it, or people in real life, and I think, let's give it a second chance, or it's been a while since I read that, let's give it a reread. 4. Why do you reread books? Why wouldn't I? Why do you re-listen to music? Why do you re-watch films? You enjoy them. They evoke a certain sort of emotion there. You miss the characters. 5. How do you reread? Faster, slower, just the best bits? I didn't actually know there were people who only read the best bits of books when they reread them. I tend to reread from start to finish and get it all done over again. 6. Who or what do you reread? More specifically, which authors or genres or individual books? I reread anything that I have liked in the past and that has made me feel a certain type of way. If something has left me feeling particularly cozy, or it's made me laugh, then that is something that I will revisit. Furiously Happy by Jenny Lawson is a book that I have read multiple times because I felt particularly sad when I first read this book, and this made me feel less lonely and less sad, and every time those emotions would appear, I would reread it, and I reread this book as the first book I read each year for a few years there. There are books that I know are going to be literary and sometimes I'm feeling a bit pretentious and literary, so I will read those books. Is there a book that you found better when you reread it? Yes, that is Don't Call Us Dead by Dinez Smith. And this is a poetry collection. And I think that if you read poetry the way that I read poetry, then maybe you're likely to find it better upon each read. And so what I tend to do is I'll read a collection of poems and then I read them exactly like a novel. I'm able to see the sound and, you know, the topic and all that, but I'm not properly reading it. And then I go in a second time, and upon a reread, I will usually find that the book has improved because I can focus on what the author is getting at. I'm no longer reading it as though it's a novel. I'm looking at the way the poet has formed their poems. And so because of that, I ended up thinking this one was an improvement. 8, and one that was worse. And this is where I wanted to talk about a book that I reread recently and I was going to record an entire video about. And that book is At Bertram's Hotel by Agatha Christie. I recently uploaded a video in which I said that At Bertram's Hotel was my favourite Miss Marple book. And it was a new kind of summer tag. In that video, I talk about how when I was younger, they used to air this film all the time, and this was the Miss Marple that I saw the most. And there was a great deal of nostalgia about this book. It's the one that I think about when I think Miss Marple. I go straight to At Bertram's Hotel. I know the story inside out. After recording that video, I ended up feeling particularly nostalgic and like I wanted to read this book. And I was supposed to be reading something else, but this was weighing on my mind. And so I started reading. Immediately, I'm loving Agatha Christie's writing style. However, I also begin to notice some huge flaws in this story. I'm beginning to think that I'm not the biggest fan of the books that Agatha Christie wrote during the 1960s, because when I read a lot of Poirot books last year, they were all coming from that era of Agatha Christie's writing, and I did not like a single one of them. I also am not the fondest of Poirot. It's just the natural way of things. With At Bertram's Hotel, despite the fact that I love the coziness and I really like what Agatha Christie is talking about, it's all over the place. The main plot point of this book doesn't happen until page 200, and in this edition there are only 300 pages. Therefore, quite a lot of this book is just spent going all around the houses, mentioning things, and you get this undercurrent of crime, which is great. And I feel like this book would have been great for a radio drama at the time. It really does remind me of the Paul Temple series that was aired on the radio. I believe it was in the 1950s. If you can find them, definitely worth a listen. But this book started to remind me of that, and that is what a lot of Agatha Christie of the 60s does for me. It reminds me of radio plays. And, admittedly, my favourite adaptation of this is the June Whitfield radio play, and I wonder whether my adoration of that radio play has fueled my liking of this book. So this time around, this book fell short. However, I don't know whether it is still a favourite of mine because of the nostalgia it evokes, and whether I am able to accept all of its flaws, but because of the coziness and the nostalgia, not care. I don't actually think that I care that I didn't like this book that much this time round, because it just reminds me so much of my youth and listening to this radio play. The June Whitfield radio plays were the first radio plays that I ever properly listened to. This was pre-Talking Heads, this was pre-The Archers, this was the first radio play that I discovered. Despite the fact that I now can tell, as not just a reader, but as a writer as well, that this isn't the best written of the Miss Marples, it still holds a special place in my heart. 9. Which one book have you reread most times? I don't reread as many books as I used to, because fortunately, when I became a teenager, every birthday and Christmas my parents would buy me tons of books or give me book vouchers, and charity shops exist, and people were forthcoming with giving me books. And because of that, I know this story, and I'm going to share this story. In year 4, I discovered Jacqueline Wilson. My teacher at the time, Mrs. Johnston, or Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, I think, had a little bookshelf, and on this bookshelf she had The Bed and Breakfast Star by Jacqueline Wilson. I didn't know what a bed and breakfast was, but I appreciated Elsa's story. It's about this young girl, Elsa, who lives with her mother and her stepfather and her two half-siblings. And having this blended family seems somewhat reminiscent of my house. I could empathise with Elsa because she was poor and I was poor. And that was what I liked about Jacqueline Wilson's stories. She wasn't writing about these really rich people. I really liked this story. I found it funny. And I read that, and I read the story of Tracy Beaker. And then it was the time when my brother used to take me every Saturday to the late shop with him round the corner. And one day I happened to come across The Bed and Breakfast Star. And I can't remember whether he bought the book for me, but he might have done. This was way back when. This will have been, what, 2000, 2001? I didn't own many books, as I say, but that was the book that I would reread, and I've always struggled with insomnia, but my mum would leave the landing light on, and I actually did end up ruining my eyes with this. I would lie back on my bed holding The Bed and Breakfast Star up so that I could see it by the light from the landing, and my book ended up ruined. I read it that much it fell apart. Yeah, I would reread that book every weekend. Sometimes if we were on a holiday, I would reread it every day. By holiday I mean school holiday, I never went away. But yeah, so it was The Bed and Breakfast Star, and even now, all these years later, 20 years later, I know that that book is the one that I reread the most. It's the story that I remember, and as an adult it's not something I'm ever going to reread. I've definitely done my time with Jacqueline Wilson now, but I'm very appreciative of that one. That's that tag done. That tag is over and done with and complete. And so I guess I better tag some people. So I'll tag Marianne Maronsky, Sunbunny Reads, Steve Partridge, Sophie of Redhead Reading, and Mindy's Book Journey. 5 people, 5 fingers, sorted. I hope that you got something out of this video besides sheer boredom, and until next time, that is all.